recording.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Consciousness Hour. The show today is of particular interest to me because it's I'll be interviewing somebody whose work I've discovered somewhat by chance and has now absolutely fascinated me. The background is that, as you know, I'm researching material for my 9th book, which will be entitled Opening the Doors of Perception. And this book will be dealing with the liminal areas of human experience. And I'm particularly fascinated by such things as schizophrenia, temporal lobe epilepsy, Alzheimer's disease, autism, these kind of areas. And I decided to do a search on Amazon to try and find any books on migraine, because myself, I am a classic migraine sufferer myself, and I was very, very keen to see if any other books had been written on the subject rather than the classic Oliver Sacks book that came out many years ago now. And as I went through, I came across a book by a gentleman called Richard Grossinger, who is an American writer, an American polymath, really, effectively. And he'd written a book on the migraine aura. And I downloaded it on my Kindle, and I read it, and I was absolutely stunned as to the details in the book and everything else, because it resonated so strongly with my own experiences. But I then contacted Richard, and I was delighted when Richard responded to me. And Richard suggested that his work is much, much broader than simply the book on migraine. You know, he's written so many different books. And he sent me the trilogy of books. And I started reading these books, and I have to say that I almost got to the point where I wanted to give up writing myself, because Richard writes in a style that many of us can only dream of being able to do. His style is highly literate, it is highly clever and very, very witty, and I have to say that on many occasions I was actually, right when I was reading the book, actually applauding almost to say, wow, I wish I could have put it in that way. And many of you who follow me on Facebook will know that I've posted quite a few of Richard's comments and everything else on my Facebook page. I was therefore delighted when Richard agreed to be a guest on Consciousness Hour, because I feel that he will be a fascinating guest. We had a chat yesterday for hours because it's a meeting of minds. So we now have Richard island off the coast of Maine, which is located, and it's absolutely fantastic location. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce everybody to Richard. Welcome to the show, Richard.
Thank you, Tony. I should warn the listeners that, as they probably know, that you're breaking up a little bit. So that may come through on the audio, and I may not always hear your question clearly, so we'll just have to make do with that.
We will get by with that, because there is also a delay on the line as well. So effectively, as we agreed yesterday, that I will ask you a question, and then I will let you go with it, and then you raise your little finger when you said you've finished with it. Okay, the first thing I'd like to do is the billion-dollar question is, who is Richard Grossinger and your background, and effectively, what made you end up writing the most amazing books that you write? I mean, effectively, so you can just go with the flow on that one. It'd be really interesting to just hear, and I'm sure everybody would be fascinated to hear.
Well, you mentioned, the trilogy you mentioned is Dark Pool of Light, which has a subtitle, Reality and Consciousness. And it's not the very last book I did, but close to it. I mean, I published that, I think, in 2010, and it represented a few years' work going back before that. I consider that I've arrived at a kind of unique points, because I have a lot of different influences that converge in what I do. I have an intellectual background in getting a PhD in anthropology. I've, for most of my life since teenage years, hung out with people studying the occult and consciousness and kind of hermetic topics, so I've been influenced directly by constant communication with them. I also had, my original ambition was literary, to be a literary writer. I started off with kind of paragons like William Faulkner, Herman Melville, D.H. Lawrence, and really early on wrote in homage to them, and did not worry so much about the consciousness or esoteric level. I was trying to do literary work, and that comes through. That's a thread I've maintained my whole life, and I've really been writing, frightening as that is, for more than 50 years. And then I also was in psychoanalysis as a child, starting at age 8. So I had the experience from age 8 to 17 of a very intense classic Freudian psychoanalysis, which was a very kind of, and it was an initiation into symbolism in the way that psychoanalysis is not anymore, mostly for the better. But it wasn't so much a psychoanalysis as a training in symbolic thought, very young. And that converged with what I eventually was doing literarily and with the kinds of things I was studying. And it took me a long time to get that synthesis together. You can imagine what a mess I was in college and graduate school, especially graduate school. The teachers really hated what I was trying to do because I was breaking all the rules. I wasn't doing the kind of stuff they wanted. I mean, I was trying in the mid-'60s to study shamanism and mythology in the anthropology department at the University of Michigan and getting nowhere. And ultimately had to write a thesis on the ethnography of fishing cultures because I just couldn't get anybody to pay attention to what interested me. It really took until my early 30s when I got Doubleday, the publisher, to fund me for a couple of years to do a history of medicine with an emphasis on alternative medicine and ethnomedicine and non-Western paradigms, that I began to pull the different threads together and write a book which represented simultaneously my literary interests, my anthropological interests, and my esoteric interests. And after that, I ended up carving out 4 main topics. Healing and alternative medicine is one, then cosmology and astronomy, my main book being The Night Sky, Soul and Cosmos, which I rewrote a few years ago and is the most recent thing I've done. And then embryology and the origin of life, and finally consciousness. And other things that I've done have been offshoots from that. I've done some pure literary memoir writing. I've done books on individual topics, like the one on migraine auras that Anthony found. And I guess that's a pretty good survey, at least at one level, of how I arrived at what I did. I actually am thinking of something else I want to say, which is that I sometimes think of my life in terms of initiations. There was the initiation by the first Freudian psychoanalyst when I was 8, and he taught me to interpret dreams. Then there was an initiation in high school in my writing class where the poet Chuck Stein brought in a tarot deck and was writing poems, and the teacher kind of triggered me into putting down my thoughts and writing, at which point I switched from the notion of clinical dialogue to literary dialogue. Then there was the initiation when I was studying healing, when I ultimately trained somewhat in homeopathy, but mainly trained in cranial sacral therapy and related palpation techniques, which enabled me to feel energy for the first time. And it changed my view of everything and made a quantum leap in all my work, not just my writing on healing, but my writing in general and my Tai Chi practice. And then that was mainly in the late 80s, early 90s, and it took me to 2008 to begin to train as a psychic. Initially at the Berkeley Psychic Institute, and then with John Friedlander. who is a graduate of that and also a Sethian. And that training has been the most recent initiation and the one that most influences my work in the present.
As an anthropologist and somebody that's actually trained in social sciences, what is your take on esoteric experiences and the kind of experiences you've had? I mean, what do you believe them actually to be in general terms from the things you have experienced yourselves? What do you think is actually happening?
Well, it didn't seem like as big a question as it was when you started to articulate it, but as it kind of runs through my mind, it's a pretty large question. The first thing I thought to say, and it's still the main thing, is that the primary visionary experience is existence. That we exist at all is such an incredible visionary experience that it subsumes all the others. And parenthetically, when materialist neuroscientists complain about consciousness, one of them very smartly remarked that he wasn't worried about telepathy or telekinesis or any of those things. He found consciousness itself disturbing enough. That is, if you had non-local consciousness, that blew up his whole theory of the universe, and you might as well throw in telepathy and telekinesis and remote viewing and the rest. I don't have, other than my life, an extraordinary, and in some ways this is not dissimilar to your background to a certain point, I don't have any extraordinary esoteric experiences. What I have is this much broader kind of, I would consider it a much broader psycho-spiritual guidance, a little bit like Jung's individuation. I feel as though every time in my life that I've used my will to try and make something happen, it hasn't worked. And every time I've been receptive, the most amazing things have come into being. But you couldn't ever say that those things were outside the realm of chance or of the ordinary ups and downs of life itself. But nonetheless, collectively, I've come to have an enormous faith in the notion of guidance, even though I could, if somebody wanted to convince me that it was all good luck or my own doing or any number of other things that don't involve an esoteric interpretation, I could go with that too. I don't think it matters. I actually think that the universe is so deep, ultimately, that you can do the same things with different interpretations, and that what really matters is the process, not the name you give it or the model or explanation you put to it. I think that so many people who are nihilists or materialists. Well, I remember a good friend of mine is the mystic Andrew Harvey, who you may know of. Do you know Andrew Harvey at all? He told me once that he couldn't wait for the reaction of some of his atheist friends when they died. He would love to have been there when they woke up, he said, in his dramatic fashion. And I said, no, that there would never be such a moment, because if in fact that happens, they would simply wake up to what they already knew, and that their nihilism and their materialism was simply an act. It was superficial, and that it might take them a long time. For instance, they might, for an interminable period, pretend to be dead, and then kind of gradually notice that something was still there. But it wouldn't be like a shock to their persona, because the persona itself is grounded in reality. And so you can get the most materialistic skeptic, professional skeptic, And I think on a dime, if they experience the roots of their own beingness, they'll change. And it won't be like a great shock, because they won't be changing into anything except what they in fact are. And that's why I say just existing at all is the primary and cardinal esoteric experience. And that's too often forgotten. Too often people either take it for granted or think that you need something special in order to be in an esoteric place. That's not true. There isn't an esoteric universe and a real universe. There's only this universe, and it is highly esoteric and equally highly real. And that's its beauty. John Friedlander likes to remark that some people say, well, why can't I make my occult powers, my psychic powers work all the time? And John says, well, that would be like the game of golf if every time you hit the ball, it went in the hole, and you got a hole in one every time. He said you'd lose interest in playing. He said, we spent God knows how many trillion years outside of time designing this reality. And it's an extremely elegant, exquisitely subtle, complex reality. And we're not just going to blow it up in order to play a few tricks or move a few stones around or get what we want. Because what we think we want in a limited karmic sense has nothing to do with the overall design that we as a higher intelligence has collaborated in producing with all these other intelligences.
Very intriguing comments you made there, and I'll come back to one or two of them. The idea that we are somehow complicit or involved in the creation of whatever we consider to be consensual reality is a very intriguing idea, and one that has fascinated me for quite a few years, particularly the idea of this being some form of simulation that we're existing within. But I'm very interested at the moment. We can draw out on that one later, but one of the things that I'm very, very interested in is the areas that really hit me between the eyes, metaphorically, in reading your Dark Pool book, the first book, was your arguments about the way in which modern neurology is missing the point about how consciousness is created by the brain. And of course it isn't. It's more than that. And some of the points you made were extremely powerful in terms of that. And I would like you to share with the listeners some of the general themes that in that first volume you follow through. And then at the end of that, maybe you could discuss in a little bit greater detail who these we are, who the collective group is that's sort of creating this simulation, this black iron prison, this mind-forged manacles, whatever we want to term it. I'm sorry I always do this. I have this whole theme of questions. But effectively, because of the way the signal is at the moment, I know I can only ask the questions and then let you run with them. So if that made sense, if I can leave you to talk about that.
Okay. Well, first of all, I wanted to just make a nod to your own work, because we've been reading each other's books, and I could flip this around and do an equivalent interview of Anthony that ask him just as interesting questions and get just as compelling answers. And I did want to say that the thing about his work that struck me, and this is somewhat parenthetical to the question, but it's a good point at which to mention it. In reading his book, a couple of his books, initially my feeling was I don't agree with him, because he's involved in trying to locate experiences of other realities and other dimensions. He's trying to locate that in the physiology of the brain. But then as I read further, I realized that was exactly what he wasn't trying to do. And that what he was doing was something much more interesting, and was the reverse, not the reverse, but the reverse pathway into what I was trying to do. I feel as though I rather instinctively took the conventional pathway of going through matter to mind, or through matter to mind to spirit. And he reverses that order in his own work. He goes from spirit and mind and consciousness expansion to matter, to quantum physics, and to neuroscience. And that means that he arrives at the riddles and uncertainty states and kind of wave collapses of quantum physics by a totally different route than the conventional one, and I find it very convincing. It's a very subtle point and hard to make, but what I would say is I have tended to be very interested in, but to dismiss, the kind of Heisenbergian uncertainty principle, a whole quantum physics thing, as being relevant only to very, very small affairs at a very, very infinitesimal nano size, and to take all the people who are trying to make more of it as being kind of new age metaphor creators who are trying to bridge the gap between quantum particle reactions, microtubules inside the cell, and consciousness in the brain. Anthony actually, without directing it at me, catches me up in that argument and says, no, that actually works if you come at it not from a Darwinian evolutionary standpoint of building up from particles through atoms, molecules, cells, but if you come at it the other way, from consciousness, from astral projection, from remote viewing, if you come at it that way and then go in and then arrive at the quantum wave collapse, you have a very different view of the same thing. So that's how I would like to bracket his own work in relation to mine. Then I would say that maybe a biographical, autobiographical thing would help here. I was not intending to write Dark Pool of Light. I was simply doing the psychic work and starting in 2008 and keeping a journal of my discoveries. When we've been living in Maine a lot of the time now, and I went on a hike with a guy who was the editor-in-chief of MIT Press in Boston. And in the course of it, he offered to trade books, and I ended up getting a huge volume on neuroscience and consciousness and philosophy from him, and I began reading it. And immediately the gap between it and the psychic work struck me, in that the psychic work believes in consciousness as self-arising and self-authenticating, which is the Hindu view, and neuroscience believes in consciousness as an epiphenomenon of molecular activity. And I can find ways, especially in some of the Buddhist, in some Buddhist thinking, in which you could bring those two together. And you'll see in volume 2, I make that attempt to kind of bring neuroscience together with Hinduism through like Dzogchen Buddhism and stuff. But for the moment, just taking the straightforward view, these are opposites. And the consciousness of Hinduism or Buddhism is a self-arising phenomenon that is rooted in itself. It's the base luminosity of the universe. The consciousness of neuroscience is created by the fact that little robotic molecular clusters do a better job in a Darwinian universe of consuming energy and consuming and converting energy if they have banks of monitors inside them, monitors that control other monitors in a hierarchy. Now, why these little robots should have such an avidity for consuming energy, God knows, there's no explanation for that. But in the Darwinian model, there is it's taken for granted that molecular structures try and convert more and more energy, and that's how they survive. Consciousness in that model is the point at which the filaments, whatever you want to call them, the synapses, the neurons making up those monitors, reach a threshold such that a monitor monitoring another monitor, and so on, in a kind of cascade of system controls, suddenly wakes up and realizes that it exists. That to me is a stretch, to say the least. I developed my little kind of homily of that, which was a light goes on, a light goes off, but it wasn't even a light, as opposed to the Buddhist ground luminosity. It's almost there's no way to imagine what in neuroscience is added to molecular configurations to create self-awareness and to create the kind of internal model of self-identification, persona, and existence. I mean, what would you add? What would be the critical point at which you would add something? And I finally draw the line that neuroscience is brilliant at explaining consciousness, everything about it, once it's inside matter. But it can't do anything with it. It can't do anything about getting it into matter. And ultimately, this is a religion for them. I think somebody called it metaphysical materialism, which is a good name. It's a religion that you cannot violate the materialistic premise of the universe. And if you can't violate that, then it's sort of like a crossword puzzle. There are certain rules, and in order to fit it into the grid, you cannot invoke anything non-local for consciousness. You can see this conflict like in the recent blow-up about the TEDx talks, where I have an aunt by marriage through my stepmother, who runs salons in Los Angeles, and her entire salon was shut down by TED, whatever the home organization is, because she had Rupert Sheldrake and Russell Targ, and I'm forgetting the name of that other English guy who writes on UFOs and things. And even though they were all scientists and scientifically trained, I mean, Rupert Sheldrake's a biologist, Russell Targ is a physicist and engineer, and yet the whole thing was shut down because they talked about non-local consciousness. It had not violated anything scientific. It had violated the ideology, the religion. So that what I feel is that's the nature of the belief system. And to answer the last part of your question, which almost slipped away, is I don't think any of that is an accident. I think that this is the steep headwind that consciousness hits as it encounters its own shadow at the depths of creation. It's basically encountering the aspect of creation that, whatever you want to call it, God, the original luminosity, could not get at. And when it hits that, it flips around. It's almost like Keats's negative capability. It flips around into something that needs to be resisted in order to manifest. And we are going through that complete shadow state. And everything on earth is serving that. And by that I mean that all of these transnational corporations who are blind to anything except profit and consuming the planet, to ISIS with its wish to create the caliphate and you know the incredible cruelty to the people it captures. all of these are still, they're not like apostasies or satanic violations of the rise of consciousness. They indicate just how deep the dialectic is and how hard consciousness is going to have to struggle to reach the bottom of its own texture in the universe. So that's my summary answer there.
Wow. Wow is all I can say there. Very much thank you for your comments about my own writing as well. That's terribly kind of you. One of the things that leapt to mind when you were discussing there, and particularly with regards to the Rupert Sheldrake TED issue, is that you may or may not be aware, but over here in the UK, there is a guy called Brian Josephson, who is one of the few living Nobel Prize winners in physics that are British. And a few years ago, Brian Josephson, well, what happened a few years ago? There was the British, they wanted to do a series of stamps to commemorate individuals who had been awarded the Nobel Prize. And Brian Josephson, because he was a living person who had won the Nobel Prize for, I think, his discovery of the Josephson junctions, I think it was, he was supposed to be on a stamp. And there was a massive furore in the country, and the scientists here, the materialist reductionist scientists, said this is an aberration because Brian Josephson is infamous for actually being interested in ESP, telekinesis, and very other things. And indeed, I did have lunch with Brian Josephson a few years ago. We were both members of the Scientific and Medical Network, and we were at a commemorative event for commemorating the life of Professor David Bohm. And I had lunch with Brian there. It wasn't because he'd seeked me out. We just happened to be on the same table. And he was so fascinated by it. He had an app on his phone which was about trying to prove ESP statistically. And he was an intriguingly interesting guy. But the way in which the authorities would not accept the fact that even a scientist of his caliber was willing to invest their time in doing this. It seems as soon as you do this, you're beyond the pale. You're suddenly unaccepted. So suddenly your qualifications mean nothing to them, even though you are probably one of the most incredible scientists ever. And the same goes with Rupert Sheldrake. So your discussion there about your aunt actually having her place closed down is absolutely horrendous. You know, it's very, very terrifying when you discover things like this. But that was my little rant there for that.
Right. And my feeling is that it's fine to get. I mean, I enjoy getting upset about it too and outraged, but I think you also have to recognize it, as I said, as being in the service of this incredibly intricate and paradoxical reality that we've designed, and that it would not be as deep if it didn't have that level of resistance to it. And I think that the fanatical religious materialism at another level is a recognition. It's hard to put it into words. If you reduce everything to molecularity or atomicity or energy, thermodynamic energy, you exclude anything having to do with psyche or consciousness or spirit or other dimensions, you, in a sense, have created a grounding that you can then convert into a path exactly through itself into spiritual territory. So that when people eventually go through that path into spirituality, they will be much more effective than some of their predecessors who jumped right in. Their shamanic and alchemical and Christian mystical predecessors who did not ground it in the full molecularity. I have a section about that in The Night Sky that was very hard to write, about the about why, after the level that the Greeks and Romans achieved scientifically, you have the Middle Ages. And you actually have centuries and centuries of misdirection and complete mythologization and almost like a superstitious universe before you get Newton and Galileo. I would say Copernicus and Kepler too, only they were fence sitters. And I think the reason is that you had to upholster the universe before you could fill it again with luminosity, and that we're doing that again now. We're creating a very deep materialistic universe, and eventually we will fill that with spirit. Probably not in your and my lifetime, but in terms of the overall endeavor of consciousness. And this is a very far-reaching topic that I could go on, but for the sake of the interview, let's pause and let you send the volley back to you.
Okay, because one of the things that the points that you're making there, I think, was very, very valid, was the idea of how it is that we went into the Dark Ages, and effectively we lost an awful lot of the knowledge of the ancients. But on top of that, there's a very, very valid point to be made that, of course, Newton himself, I saw an article very recently where they were saying that Newton's Principia could not have been written had he not been involved in esoteric traditions. And of course, it's one of the kind of hidden things of science that Newton himself was very much into alchemical ideas and everything else, and it very much structured his ideas. Yeah,
and he himself said that he described gravity initially as the way that God was in touch with every molecule in the universe at the same time. Yeah, I don't know if he called it. He probably wouldn't have called it molecule at that point, but he was in touch with every part of the universe simultaneously. So God and gravity were maybe not synonymous, but gravity was the force by which God communicated with the universe.
And of course, was it, his great opposition, was it Leibniz that he had issues with? I can't remember who it was now, but the idea, if there's an infinite universe, God would have had to have chosen to have placed the Earth in a particular place in the infinite universe, and because God can only make perfect decisions, he would have had a trauma as to where to place reality or whatever it is. Now, one of the things that you touched upon again that I'm really, really keen to pursue is you use the term that we designed, and you've used this a couple of times now, the idea that somehow we are involved in the design of whatever this is. Can you expand upon that a little bit, please?
Well, there are many pathways into that, and I don't know that I'll necessarily pick the most interesting one. Maybe the way to go into it is to pick it at two levels. At one level, it's just a kind of very simple thought experiment with one's own consciousness, almost like an epistemological experiment. When you ask yourself internally what you are and how you got here and what's going on, any alternative answer than that you're involved in designing the reality that you're involved in has more problems. Not more problems scientifically or psychologically, just has more problems in a kind of gut intuitive sense. The other answers don't really speak to the particular kind of focal point of one's own attention. And you've gone into this much more kind of objectively by talking about theories in which you've evoked holography and quantum physics in particular in making this point. So I won't go there. I'll just make the argument that it's a form of self-witnessing that it arises from. And then on the other side, I will point to Seth, to the Seth writing, the Seth dictations through Jane Roberts, which I think I read them in the 70s and I loved them, but I completely missed their overall significance. And it took working with John Friedlander, who's a Sethian who was there when Jane Roberts did the transcriptions, for me to appreciate them fully. And you were talking about wanting to get into it. I particularly like an odd book called Adventures in Consciousness, which has a terrible title, but and is more like one of Jane Roberts's books than one. But it quotes not only Seth but Seth too, which is a different vibration, and it raises an issue which John himself raises, that the reason that Jane was channeling Seth was that she was part of the huge multi-personhood, the collective intelligence that Seth was the name for, but not in the present, in the future. So that she was, in a sense, attuning to her future self when she was channeling Seth. But if you flip it around and look at it the other way, this multi-personhood, this vast intelligence made up of multiple intelligences, chose a channel through which it could reach the Earth people in the present, by going through a past form of one of its components. And I think that the version of the universe that Seth gives, and John does, to my mind, an even more subtly structured version of that, is that we're not really talking about designing the universe out of our own consciousness. What we're talking about is a huge interdependent collaboration in which we come into being in relationship to entities and intelligences all through the universe, all through reality, all through interdimensionality, but we're unaware of most of them. In fact, we're pretty much unaware of I'd say, almost all of them, and that these not only include physical entities in other systems, star systems and dimensional systems, but include ourselves at other ages. For instance, the younger versions of ourselves are also beings in this configuration that we're in interdependence with, because these are separate beings. Also, alternate probable selves that arise from energy that we're creating but don't inhabit, that maybe don't produce alternate universes at the same kind of texture of reality as we exist at, but still have potentiation in some place within all that is. And so what's happening is not so much that we as an individual consciousness are designing this reality, as collaboratively that all these consciousnesses in this enormous interdependent network are creating it together. I had a little kind of minor flicker of this last night. We had two Jungian psychologists who live around here in Maine over to dinner, a couple, Nathan Schwartz-Salant and Lydia Schwartz-Salant. And in making the dinner, one of the dishes I made involved string beans and pecans and some soy sauce and some maple syrup and after they had left and I was cleaning up, there was a little bit left of the string bean mixture, and I was taking it out, and then one of the pecans turned out not to be a pecan, but a gigantic beetle. And it was drowning in the mixture, and I got it out, and I tried to wash it off, and I was totally unsuccessful. I did not succeed, and it died. I tried moving it outside. I put a lot of time in on it. And there was a moment when it was on its back and its legs were flailing around, and I was wanting to reassure it that I intended the best. And I just had a passing flicker. Hopeful, that it wasn't meant to be overly precious or kind of, I don't know what would be the word, kind of maudlin in a sense, but it's not quite the word I want. But I had the sense that the movement of those legs, those little flickers of those legs, that it was just in the universe, that the universe was also making that movement, and that the consciousness of that bug was not separate of the larger consciousness. And then when it ceased moving, that was a failure of what I was attempting to do, but I don't know that it was a failure of the part of the universe that was operating those little tiny legs when it was on its back. And that, I think that awareness comes and goes. You have moments when you feel close to it, and other moments when it seems, this seems like a very pagan secular realm that's incredibly difficult to mush one's way through.
I think it's very much the idea, isn't it, in my mind? Certain images and certain ideas were leaping to mind when you were talking there. And, I mean, one of the areas I've been long interested in is the concept of panpsychism, and particularly panpsychism in the West. And I think it was Corbin, the famous Sufi writer, the French Sufi writer, that actually wrote a fascinating book on the whole idea of panpsychism. Now, I don't know if you've come across the work of Professor Bernard Heisch at all. And Bernard is an astrophysicist in California. He's based in California in Menlo Park, but I know he also spends time up in Boulder at the institute up there. And he's one of the guys that's working on zero-point energy. And Bernard has actually been on this show in the past, and Bernard has written a fascinating book called The God Theory. And again, this is the idea that, to quote the old Bill Hicks monologue in the end, where we are one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. And this idea that, there is a singularity, that there is a singular consciousness, that we are all part of, we're all shards of it, reminds me in many ways, of the Kabbalistic belief system of the Or Ein Sof. There are also so many themes within Gnosticism, within Sufism, that really, really nail this. And it was interesting when you mentioned Seth, because I don't know if you've read my book, The Daemon, but in The Daemon, I touch upon the idea that we all have this kind of higher self that is embodied within us, that is part of the collective consciousness, that actually knows everything about us, that's part of the program, that understands the program. Never quite sure, but when I came across the Seth material, although I've not read any of it, I readily admit I haven't, but I will be after on your advice. But effectively, it has always struck me that Seth seems to be some kind of manifestation of my daemon idea, and the idea that we have a part of us that's immortal. And it's again the kind of the embodied part of the pleroma, that the Gnostics would argue, that there's this kind of shard of something else that's inside ourselves that is attuned with the greater something. And in your book, it kept resonating when I was reading your book, was the idea of this consciousness behind the consciousness, the mysteries of consciousness. Because one of the things that you touched upon, and I'd really like to just expand upon this in the final 10 minutes or so, and it's something you write wonderfully about, is the concept of the zombie, the concept of the idea of how do we know that other people are actually sentient, because we have no really objective way of knowing that this. And I think is it John Searle? I can't remember whether it's Searle or whoever that comes across this idea. But for a time now, I'd like to sort of spin off into that area. And for the last 10 minutes or so, because with these programs, we never have enough time. And the guests are always fascinating. And I feel that we could talk about this for hours and hours, because your books just are rich. And I still again say to the listeners out there, get hold of Dark Pool. It is a wonderful read. It is an absolutely wonderful read. But I mean, it's one of the few books, I did mention to this, it's one of the few books that you sent me the copies of it. And I found it, because it's a big book, it was difficult to hold. So I immediately downloaded the Kindle version, because I felt I needed to make so many notes and cross-references. The only way I could do it would be on Kindle. And I'm just about tonight to download the second volume, which I'm hoping to take on holiday with me, just to read through as well and just really enjoy. But as a final point then, the idea of other consciousnesses, other entities, other beings, what's your take on that? And finally, in the final few minutes, what would you like to get across to the listeners as to where your work is taking you in the future? Because you are such a polymath, so there's so many areas your work can go. But, so it would be about the concept of the zombie and other consciousnesses, and then the final few minutes where you're going next, and also where people can contact you, where they can pick up your work, your website, and the various other things you're involved in as well.
Okay, well, I think if anybody's going to suffer there, it might be the zombie, because I covered that pretty thoroughly in the first volume of Dark Pool of Light. I think I even gave a list of all the names of the zombie movies and things and I went through that quite extensively. And sometimes you go through something so extensively that does it. You don't think about it. You don't think about it again. I mentioned in the introduction to the third volume, afterwards meeting a neuroscientist at a book party for our son's book. Our son is an environmental biologist, and I got set up talking to him because we're both interested in consciousness, and I basically asked him how I can't quite remember the dialogue, but it was sort of like, how do you know any of this? How, the whole zombie thing, like why do you even believe in your own consciousness? And he looked at me disbelieving for a while, and then I think he said, because it's more fun that way. And I thought that was such a great answer, because in truth, that's why people buy into the notion that they exist, these other people exist. It's more enjoyable. It's a better game. And I won't too much get into all of that, because there's a bunch of loose ends to pick up on. I did want to say something which I've been thinking about more recently. As I've been a publisher. My wife and I started North Atlantic Books in the 70s out of our journal IO, which we did in the 60s. And then just recently we've been backing out, kind of retiring and semi-retiring and turning it over to the staff, because it's a nonprofit. We don't own it. And something that has been occurring to me that didn't occur to me over all the years so much, and that is that my early books were published by other publishers, Harper, Sierra Club, Tarcher, Shambhala. In recent years, most of my books have been published by me through North Atlantic Books, because the level that I'm dealing with is not something that any publisher would tolerate. And the books are generally ignored. It's unbelievable how few of them sell. If Lindy and I had not founded a publishing company, none of them would have been published. And I point that out as part of the fact that listeners may say, well, if he's writing about all these interesting things, why haven't I heard of him? Why don't I know the books? I don't have the answer to that. The books seem to me to be operating at a level of synthesis and complexity that is the same as all the best books I read, and yet almost instinctively, not instinctively, but inevitably, they don't sell at all. Now, psychics have given me reasons for it. One psychic told me if they sold, you would never do the work at the level of depth necessary. So the spirits are making sure they don't sell. That sounded a little bit like a rationalization that I could use. I have others. It's interesting to me that my father, and I have many fathers. I have a stepfather who raised me and whose last name I had through the early part of my life. I was Richard Towers for a long time until I was 12. I have a legal father whose last name I have, and a genetic father that I never met, who I only found out about when I was 30 after my mother's suicide. And my legal father ran a huge resort hotel of the same last name that I have, Grossinger's. It was incredibly famous way beyond anything it earned. And I feel as though the karma from that almost means that I have to go underground, because the name itself, Grossinger, is associated to me with hype, Mad Men, the whole Madison Avenue PR thing. Then, interestingly, Lindy's and my daughter is fantastically successful and famous as a multimedia performance artist, writer, movie director. She has her own professional name, Miranda July, that she took on. And I remember once when our kids were very young, she turned to our son and said, "We're going to be more famous than them, Robin, aren't we?" And that was true. Our generation is kind of caught in between. And so I mentioned this. I would encourage people to look at my website, which is under my name. And there are many things to read on it. I was thinking of calling your attention to I have all my travel journals, and the time I went to England is on there, so you can look that up and see what's his name, David Lorimer, isn't it, the Scientific Network, when we went and visited him in Scotland. That story's on there.
You know David. Oh, right.
We went to his house and had a strange. I didn't realize he was like a real prep school guy too, and a golfer. But I would also say that my more recent books, The Dark Pool of Light, the first volume is on neuroscience, physics, biology. The second volume is on psychic and psycho-spiritual traditions, and the third volume is called The Crisis and Future of Consciousness. I don't think the third volume, which is pretty much the best thing I've written, has even sold 400 copies yet. And then I redid, after that, my 1980s book, The Night Sky, which I did originally for Sierra Club. And I redid it under the subtitles Soul and Cosmos. And it's a really broad scope book on astrophysics, consciousness, the shamanic universe, non-Western astronomy, Buddhist astronomy, science fiction, star themes and pop culture. I'm a very pop culture writer and constantly quote from old rock and roll songs and fairy tales and nursery rhymes. And so that book is just relatively newly out. So those are the things that I would most point people to. And then there's also the two embryology books I did. One of them's called Embryogenesis, Species, Gender, and Identity. And the other one is Embryos, Galaxies, and Sentient Beings, How the Universe Makes Life. And then there are my old books on healing, which are under the title Planet Medicine. And the Migraine Auras book is an offshoot of that, as is my book, Homeopathy, the Great Riddle. So that's a little bit of a summary of my work, but going on my website will help. I provided links to chapters from things and also links to other interviews I've done, and most of them audio, not with no video, but some of them video. So I'm probably running out of time here. I'm sensitive to the fact that you have an hour and you don't want to put a closure on it. So what else would I say if there's any time? I would call attention to North Atlantic Books, our publishing company, which has been, unlike my writing, has been commercially successful. It employs 26 full-time people in Berkeley. And in an era which is horrendous for publishing companies, the post-Amazon era, it's still doing pretty well, and it has a great list that's cutting edge and different from what you'd ordinarily find. I mean, our recent titles range from the Cree Medicine Bundle to a book called Warlords Incorporated about terrorism in the world. And all of the books are, I wouldn't say all of them, but almost all of them are pretty radical. And we really have our own identity and spin, which has kept us going. We are not a New Age press or an occult press. We're different from Shambhala and inner traditions. We're kind of literary and political too. We just signed Vandana Shiva as an author, the eco-activist, anti-GMO crusader. And we try to be a very politically astute press, like New York Review of Books astute, and at the same time to be literary and honor the kind of avant-garde literary tradition we come out of, which is, our press was named after a poem of Ed Dorn's North Atlantic Turbine. It was not named for the region. And it got moved almost immediately from Vermont to California, where it's published most of his books, absurdly under the name North Atlantic Books. So
yeah, because
that probably more than uses up my allotment.
No, it's fine. I mean, the North Atlantic Books, yeah, that quite surprised me when I saw that. And I thought, where are they based? Berkeley, right. Okay, this is an interesting thing. But I have to say that you're a man after my own heart in the sense that you're an absolute enthusiast. You love what you do. And rather like myself, you're sort of picking information from everywhere. And I think that's the way to be. You know, we are here to learn. We are given this time here to move through as an opportunity to just understand. And I think after reading your books, and I think that's why I found them such a delight, because I was not just nodding all the time with agreement, and it's very rare for me to really come across a writer that I thoroughly enjoy. I was literally wanting to just get back to read your book. I'd finish a chapter or whatever, and I'd just be looking forward to going back to reading it. And I have to say that I haven't had a book that has inspired me and has intrigued me and I've enjoyed as much as that first volume, and I'm really looking forward to the second one. Richard, thank you very much for being an absolute wonderful guest, and I know that we will be talking again. I just know it. I just absolutely know it. So thank you very much. And again, as usual, thanks to Dia. Thank you. And thanks again to Dia Nunez in the background there over in Denver. As usual, we can't do this without Dia. So thank you very much again. Our next guest is for July is Diane Hennessy-Powell, who is a neuropsychologist, and this is going to be a fascinating interview because Diane will be telling us about some fascinating experiments she's been doing with a young Indian savant girl, and this really will blow your mind. This is real evidence of real-life telepathy. Okay, until next time, everybody, thank you very much for listening in, and again, thank you for my very special guest, Richard Grossinger. Thank you very much.